Hello, I'm Infamous Sphere. What's that? It's time for Infamous Queer.
Pride, 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 darling, darling, pride, pride 95!
It's easier to be a voice. I don't have to worry about lighting or blurring or interruptions or the fact that my hair doesn't look exactly the way it did in the last take. It's forgiving. I can just stick my voice over this unrelated footage of me doing something and it totally sounds like I just said something off camera. With music and cuts, I can definitely make it look as if this collection of still images I took on holiday is an actual video. Oh god, I'm just doing this because I have no money. But having a limited budget shouldn't stop you from pursuing your ideas. Even if your idea is to make a gay film starring random people at your university who don't even know that they're starring in a gay film in a time when homosexuality wasn't even legal. This is Winter Kept Us Warm.
It's so cold in this country. You can never get warm.
Ah yes, Winter Kept Us Warm. This 1965 film was directed by Canadian director David Sector. Despite the fact that Sector was a 22-year-old student and probably only had 3 toonies to rub together, Winter Kept Us Warm was not only Canada's first queer feature film and the first English-language Canadian film to be screened at Cannes, but was the very film that inspired David Cronenberg to become a filmmaker. But nowadays, it's forgotten. I was only the second person to review it on Letterboxd, and none of the main actors ever did anything else. David Sector himself moved to America, and his own family didn't even know that he directed this film. Well, I love a challenge, and there's nothing more awesome than the feeling of undiscovered territory, knowing you've dug up some incredibly random film that literally nobody else would bother to watch. Let's begin. September. Withdrawn, awkward, extremely Finnish Peter starts his first year at the University of Toronto. Unfortunately, as his leitmotif lets us know, he's a complete dweeb. However, it doesn't take long before his complete dweebiness brings him into contact with cool guy Canadian Doug, who decides to ridicule him one evening at dinner.
Tell me, what is that thumb doing in my plate? Is one of the kitchen boys afflicted with a leprosy? This offering is quite unacceptable.
Afterwards, Doug feels bad and decides to befriend Peter, finding something interesting about his reflective, library-dwelling ways.
The Wasteland. You know, I tried reading through this once. I couldn't make much sense out of it.
Yeah, it is pretty difficult at first. But if you work on it, it does start to make some sense.
April is the cruelest month. Obviously a reference to final exams.
The two become closer, with Peter sharing some baked goods with Doug, and Doug taking Peter out to a Harry Belafonte concert. Eventually, they're more or less dating, with Doug trying his best to draw Peter out of his shell, culminating in a scene where they frolic delightfully together in the snow. A hell of a Fenno-Canadian courtship if there ever was one. Unfortunately, Doug's plan to make sure Peter loosens up and gets a much cooler leitmotif for himself backfires, as his new friend becomes too cool, starring at a campus play and developing a new friendship with a girl. Doug spins into gay confusion.
Well, everything was fine until you met Peter. If I didn't know you better, I'd swear you and Peter...
Oh, come on, Bev, cut it out. I don't think that's very funny. Well, it's just the past couple of weeks I've been kind of hung up.
What?
So,
Tell me about it. Maybe we could discuss it or something.
well, it's something I got to work out by myself.
He breaks up with his girlfriend and he tries to get Peter to return to him, but too late, as Peter's entered into a relationship with Sandra. They have a very low-stakes fight, and then Doug plays some sad guitar, and that's it. Nobody dies, nobody converts to heterosexuality exactly, nobody even feels that weird and bad about themselves. It's an earnest, heartfelt little film about a relationship two people seemed almost oblivious to until it was over. I'll get the obvious out of the way first.
All right, look, Bev, let's just forget it, eh?
In some ways, this film isn't even good. While David Sector works valiantly with the limited resources he has, creating interesting musical motifs and bringing still photographs to life with interesting editing, Winter Kept Us Warm is often confusing and difficult to watch. The dialogue is barely audible, the camera flips wildly all over the place, meaning that we're often incredibly disoriented and don't know who's standing where and who's speaking. The ADR is unconvincing.
How are you, boy? How are you? Okay. Hey, come on. Taxi?
Yeah, I guess so.
And did I mention that significant sections of this film sound like they were recorded on a turnip? Unlike many other low-budget movies I review on the show, the story also isn't something that might inspire people to check out this fresh and innovative chap's Sector. This isn't Liquid Sky or My Own Private Idaho. It's not even as bizarre and alarmingly memorable as Ben and Arthur.
Most of the other freshmen are here already. There's only a couple of hours left to register.
Why is a film so quiet, with such low stakes, made for such little money, and arguably so poorly, in any way worthy of attention? When I evaluate queer films from the 1960s, I try and think about how they fit into the context of their time. You're never going to have a 1960s story about queer people reflect our modern attitudes. There'll always be some sad queers, teetering on the brink of self-destruction, or the only LGBT representation will be in the form of some kind of absurd villain. Most films in this time period aren't going to have anything to do with our modern queer experience, but this film does. Sector definitely has a talent for directing people.
That's a funny thing about you. What is? I don't know, you have your own sort of confidence. Peter?
Yeah?
Have you ever wished that you could see yourself through somebody else's eyes?
All the time.
His dialogue is witty and well thought out. If you've ever been to a university, you've heard the same kind of bullshit sprouted by Doug and his friends.
Yeah, they're trying to make up for that pickled abortion they delivered last night. I hear 3 fellows actually passed out at table. They must have been freshmen.
And Frida tells me that some of them still even wet their beds.
Oh, look, she's just sore because none of them are propositioned her yet.
And if you've ever been a shy person meeting someone you rather liked, the dialogue between Peter and Doug will seem very familiar. Their relationship develops very naturally, and they feel like fully realised people.
You've been in love, haven't you?
Well, I used to think so, but I'm not too sure anymore.
Why?
I don't know, sometimes I get the feeling that I mean more to Bev than she means to me.
Well, she's obviously not the right girl for you then. Just keep looking.
But I can't think offhand of any girl who's all that important.
Now, I can't be certain on this, but this might be because Sector encouraged his actors to contribute to their own characterisation.
I'm Peter Saarinen. Peter Saarinen.
Saarinen. What is that, Polish?
Finnish. But I was born in Canada.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's great to know you, Pete.
Yeah, well, I guess I better be getting back to my room.
Why is Peter a Finn? That seems random. It's a small country. There are only about 5 million of them. Most of us have probably never met a Finn and wouldn't know one from a Swede or a Norwegian. Yet Peter has a Finnish surname and shares Finnish baked goods with Doug.
Okay, would you like some coffee leipä or some pulla?
Well, I think I'll have some of that the first coffee leipä.
Doug even learns one of Peter's favourite folk songs, apparently a song that pretty much every single Finn born in the 20th century would know, so that he can play it to him, despite the fact that it's in a language that he can't even speak.
That was beautiful, Doug.
What does it mean?
Far away is my love.
I gotta go.
The specificity and authenticity of Peter's Finnishness seems a strange thing for Sector to put so much effort into, until he realised that Peter Saarinen was played by a man called Henry Tavainen, a Finn. Either Sector cast Tavainen specifically because he wanted a Finnish Canadian, or, more likely, he asked Tavainen to contribute to Peter's characterisation, and Tavainen drew on his own heritage and his own personality. Why wouldn't Peter be Finnish? Also, why wouldn't Doug be attracted to a Finn, what with their enticing sauna, sick cardamom-filled baked goods, and frequent use of the letter K? If only we'd been able to see Peter's parents and see whether Doug got flustered when Peter's mum mixed up all of Doug's pronouns. Where's Doug? Oh, she's playing his guitar. As an aside note, Finnish doesn't have any gendered pronouns, so Finns tend to scramble them when they're speaking English. But interesting cultural tidbits about the Finns and the Canadians aren't the only thing this movie has to offer.
Boy, I wish I had a broad like that.
You wouldn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
This film is very low-key, and that's what makes it notable. Peter and Doug's developing relationship isn't very dramatic. It's a slow unfolding of feelings towards each other, which both men seem completely alright with. Neither of them plunge into crisis about their growing attraction. There's no angst, nothing more than the slight confusion you'd expect when one learns something new about themselves. And yet, Peter and Doug don't end up together.
I slept with her, Doug.
You what?
I slept with her. Doug, you knew I was a virgin, didn't you?
Well, so you finally got her, eh? I hope it didn't hurt too much.
What do you mean?
You know damn well what I mean.
How is that different from the heteronormative status quo? It's not the resolution, it's how it plays out.
Why do you do so much for Peter?
I don't know. I suppose I like him.
Well, he's so different from Artie and Nick and all the guys.
Well, maybe that's why I like him, Bev.
There's nothing that suggests that Peter and Doug's relationship wasn't genuine, worthy, or loving. At worst, it was a casualty of unrequited feelings. By the end of the film, Doug is the one who was bereft, mourning the loss of Peter, whose presence he'd completely taken for granted. Maybe Doug and Peter never voiced their attraction to each other, or they considered it less serious than it actually was. Peter's relationship to Sandra develops similarly naturally, because Peter clearly likes women too, and he likes her. There's no sense that he's trying to be straight, or trying to hide from his relationship with Doug, just that he meets a new person, and that he and Doug, who probably weren't officially dating, break up in the same nebulous kind of way as they got together.
We can go for coffee.
Okay. I was planning on meeting Sandra. We can all go together then.
Sandra?
Yeah, why not?
No reason. I just didn't want to interfere.
At the beginning, Peter needed Doug, and at the end, Doug needed Peter. After this well-received debut, Sector vanished into obscurity. He directed a couple more films, but they weren't as interesting or as personal as this one. And after an ill-advised choice to direct a film straight up called Feelin' Up, he fell completely off the radar. Until his nephew Joel made the equally ill-advised choice to rent Feelin' Up at the video store, only to discover his uncle's name in the credits. "Hey uncle, what gives?" Joel undoubtedly said, and was then driven to create his own film, The Best of Sector and the Rest of Sector, exploring his uncle's contribution to the world of Canadian cinema. Sadly, this documentary seems so incredibly obscure that I can't find any information beyond its sparse IMDb.
David Sector, 22. Now a movie maker on the move.
Damn it! The Sector curse strikes again. But what about that significantly more famous Canadian director also called David? How does the man who directed dozens of movies, one of which was a weird car crash porn, have anything to do with a bisexual chap with no money forming his own campus? Winter Kept Us Warm has absolutely nothing to do with anything David Cronenberg has ever done. No, it's the fact that this exists at all that inspired Cronenberg. He too was a student at the University of Toronto, and some of his friends were in Winter Kept Us Warm. The fact that a university student just like him had actually made a film made Cronenberg believe that he could too.
I remember being absolutely astonished to see a movie that had my friends in it as actors, and that it had locations that were places that I walked every day at the University of Toronto. That was an incredible, shattering revelation for me.
So, we have this movie to thank for Cronenberg's, well, whatever it is that Cronenberg does. Should you watch it? The most amazing thing about this film is that it exists at all. That Sector managed to make a film based on his own unrequited love for a guy at a time when homosexuality was still illegal, with a budget that he raised himself, starring random people on his university campus, and make something as interesting, creative and sensitive as he did, is notable in and of itself. The fact that he was working outside the mainstream film industry meant that he was able to talk about the themes that he wanted to address in the way that he wanted to address them. It's interesting to compare this film to other films based on queer college experiences, like the similarly exuberant but much more mainstream Threesome, made in the 90s.
This is the story of Stuart, Alex, and me, and how for a while we became deviants, in both senses of the word.
Both films don't end up with the people still together, but they encapsulate the college experience, a time when you're trying to find out what you are, and you start relationships that might last and might not. Hell, Threesome has far more mental instability than Winter does, and the latter was made in a time when queer characters having random mental breakdowns were the norm. This is going to be a rare thing for me. The chance to recommend a queer film from the 60s without having to clarify that it's full of suicide, murder and despair. I'm sure Peter and Doug will become friends again, and even if they don't, they'll move on and have happy lives. There's nothing wrong with them, and nothing bad has to happen to them. I couldn't hope for anything better myself.
Remember how winter never chilled and kept us warm.